Hey everyone, tonight we're heading back, way back to a world that never met Columbus. No new world, no conquest, no colonies, just one quiet decision that changed everything. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's explore a history that never happened, but just might have. This is the world that waited. So here's the part nobody talks about. Columbus didn't go. I know, wild, right? You've probably heard the whole 1492 he sailed the ocean blue thing a dozen times. Except, he didn't. Not in my version of the story. In my version, he stood at the edge of history, blinked once, muttered something about the stars being off, and just didn't board the ship. And no one ever tells you how awkward it is when 3 ships are loaded, crews are ready, the wind's perfect, and your fearless leader is nowhere to be found. We waited, like idiots, a full hour. Someone thought maybe he overslept. Someone else thought maybe he got cold feet. And me, I was just hoping we weren't about to become part of a tragic sea ballad. Eventually, I found him. Not on deck, not praying in some chapel, no. He was just walking, circling a fig tree like it had personally insulted him. Hair all messed up, boots half-tied. I thought he was drunk. He wasn't. He looked at me, dead serious, and said, "Maybe the world doesn't need to be found right now. I swear to God." He starts rambling about dreams and voices, and how the sea whispered Latin to him. Which, by the way, how does the sea know Latin? But I didn't say that. I just nodded like, sure, totally normal. I mean, what do you say when the man you followed across Spain suddenly decides not to discover half the planet? Then he told me to send the crews home. Said something about donating the funding to a monastery. A monastery. Can you imagine explaining that to the Queen? The next morning, the docks were quiet. No sails, no cheers, no heroic departures. Just a lot of confused sailors packing up their hammocks and trying to pretend this hadn't just been the weirdest Tuesday of their lives. Most people think the voyage got delayed. Bureaucracy, storms, whatever. That's what the records say. But I was there. I saw the moment it happened, when history took a sharp left turn and didn't tell anyone. And that's the part that gets me. It didn't feel epic. It didn't feel like the course of the world just changed. It felt quiet. Like someone skipped a page and kept reading. So yeah, that's the night Columbus didn't sail. No big speech, no mutiny, no dramatic lightning bolt. Just a man who looked at the edge of the map and decided, not today. And the world? Well, it waited. You'd think that if someone walked into the royal court and said, "Hey, I've got a shortcut to Asia, and it only cost you 3 ships and mild colonial chaos," they'd be heard, taken seriously, maybe even knighted on the spot. But nope. Columbus didn't sail, and the Spanish crown, bless them, just kind of shrugged. No speeches, no scandal, not even a formal dismissal. They just moved on, quietly, like they misplaced their favourite explorer and didn't want to talk about it. Isabella, for the record, was not thrilled, but she also wasn't surprised. The guy had been chasing maps, miracles and monarchs for over a decade. People were tired. The court had newer, shinier problems to obsess over. Granada had just fallen, taxes were still terrible, and the treasury wasn't exactly overflowing with gold doubloons. So when Columbus backed out, it wasn't treated like a betrayal. It was treated like a solved problem. They reallocated his funding. Some of it went to rebuild a collapsed monastery roof. Some of it vanished into someone's cousin's canal project. You know how courts work. But here's where it gets weird. They didn't replace him. They didn't go looking for someone else to take the trip. There was no backup explorer waiting in the wings, sharpening his compass and polishing his ego. Just silence. The West became boring again. A flat blue mystery that no one had time for. Trade stayed focused on the Mediterranean, on known routes, safe maps. People kept chasing spice through Venice and Alexandria. East was where the money was. West, that was where the sea monsters lived. Allegedly. A few whispers floated around the court. What if we should have gone? What if we missed something? But they didn't last. Doubt doesn't pay taxes. And no one wants to be the noble who bankrolled a map full of nothing. So Spain turned inward. They focused on unifying their kingdom, flexing their influence in Italy, and occasionally eyeing Portugal with that weird mix of sibling rivalry and please stop conquering things faster than us energy. And Columbus? He disappeared into the countryside, taught a bit, grew a beard, wrote letters no one answered. Sometimes people saw him on the docks, just staring at the horizon like it owed him something. But the crown didn't chase him. They didn't try to revive the voyage. Not even a courtesy follow-up. It's funny how big moments don't always explode. Sometimes they just exhale and vanish. The Western Ocean sat still, quiet, unbothered, waiting. And Spain? Spain decided the edge of the map wasn't worth the trouble. At least, not yet. Columbus didn't die a legend. He didn't die a martyr, or a hero, or even a particularly well-remembered nuisance. He just slipped off the radar, which is kind of ironic, considering how obsessed he was with charts and lines and knowing where everything was. He moved inland, somewhere small. One of those towns with more goats than people and a church that only rings its bell when someone dies or forgets to cover their stew pot. He taught map-making for a while, gave lectures to young men who mostly signed up because they thought celestial navigation sounded cooler than farm math. They weren't wrong, but still, no one was hanging on his every word. The maps he once guarded like treasure, they ended up rolled in a damp crate in the back of a Jesuit storeroom. I saw them once, ink faded, corners curling. One of them had a wine stain the size of Portugal. He kept journals too, pages and pages of speculation. Ocean currents, wind patterns, mentions of mystical islands that no one could prove existed. He wrote about dreams too, always dreams, the sea talking, stars rearranging themselves, a distant land calling to him like a forgotten hymn. The scholars didn't care. They liked Ptolemy. He was orderly, predictable. Columbus? He was a little too poetic. You can't build trade routes on metaphors. He tried, God did he try, to get another audience with the crown. Wrote letters, sent couriers, even showed up once, beard wild, cloak soggy, holding a piece of driftwood he claimed had come from a western shore. Security turned him away. A prince walked by and didn't even glance at him. Eventually people just stopped saying his name, not out of spite, out of indifference. History doesn't erase the loud ones. It ignores the ones who stop shouting. And Columbus? He stopped. He still walked the coast sometimes. Still watched the waves like they owed him something. Still talked about the edge, though by then even his friends stopped correcting him. Let the old sailor have his sea, they'd say. He earned that much. He died quietly. No ceremony, no golden statues, not even a proper obituary. Just a passing mention in a local record. Cristobal Colon, cartographer, deceased, age uncertain. They buried him with a small compass. That was his request, not a cross, not a flag, a compass. He wanted to keep looking, I guess, even in death. Funny thing is, a generation later someone else would make the crossing. Different name, different country, same ocean. And Columbus? Still forgotten. Still waiting on the wrong side of history. Maps rolled tight beside him. Dreams half finished. Dust settling where glory was supposed to land. And that's how the man who nearly changed the world became a footnote in someone else's story. Sometimes you get remembered for what you did. Sometimes for what you didn't. The Atlantic used to whisper. Not in some mystical seagulls in your soul kind of way, but in the way open space always does. It begged for a story, a purpose, something to connect. But without Columbus, without the spark, the funding, the fanfare, it just sat there. Wide, blue, and ignored. Nobody called it the Atlantic with awe anymore. It became background noise, a saltwater shrug. Fishermen hugged the coasts, merchants stuck to known harbours, and monarchs with itchy coin purses turned their maps back toward places they actually understood. You want spice? Go east. You want glory? Go crush a neighbour. But west? The West was for dreamers, and most dreamers weren't welcome at court. People still looked at the horizon, sure. Sailors are like that. Eyes always drifting, hands always busy with ropes that lead nowhere. But those quiet glances, that itch to know what lay past the clouds. It dulled, because dreams without action just start to rot. Every once in a while, someone would make noise about it again. A merchant's son with a rough map and a fast tongue. A noble's cousin who'd read too many Greek scrolls. But the moment they brought up westward voyages, someone in a fancy hat would cough politely and say, "We tried that. It didn't go anywhere." The water didn't mind. It kept on being water, crashing, swaying, pretending not to care that no one was interested in crossing it. And over time, the ocean didn't seem mysterious anymore. It seemed dangerous, unprofitable, unnecessary. Cartographers stopped drawing monsters at the edge of the map, not because we stopped believing in them, but because we stopped needing the excuse. Even the ports changed. Palos, Cadiz, Lisbon. They used to hum with the kind of tension you feel right before something important happens. But that energy bled out. Sailmakers took fewer orders. Shipwrights slowed production. And the dockhands, well, they had less to load and more time to drink. I used to walk those piers late at night just to feel it again. That electric pull. That sense that the world was almost ready to tell you a secret. But the secret got quiet. The Atlantic became a boundary, not a bridge. A vast, restless wall separating what was known from what would never be. And maybe the saddest part? Nobody missed it. They just stopped looking. You'd think the day the world changed would come with trumpets, maybe lightning, a speech, a sword raised dramatically toward the heavens. Something. But no, this one slipped past. No fanfare, no headlines, no calendar scribble. Just a regular day in a regular year that nobody circled in red. The ships didn't sail, Columbus didn't go, the crown moved on. And somewhere in that shuffle of missed plans and bored officials, history made a choice, and didn't tell anyone. No war broke out, no cities fell, no prophet ran through the square yelling about the end of empires. Everything looked the same. People still farmed, still traded, still argued about taxes, but under the surface, a current shifted, a quiet ripple that would echo through centuries, if anyone had been listening. Spoiler, they weren't. The maps stayed the same, still flat, still filled with best guesses and polite lies. Here be dragons got a little faded. Uncharted became a synonym for not worth it, and nobody noticed that the edge of the known world had quietly decided to stay unknown. Europe focused inward. The East stayed the East, and the Americas, well, they stayed untouched, untravelled, and very much uninterested in joining the party. Which, all things considered, wasn't such a bad deal for them. But from where I was standing, from the dock, from the classroom, from the echoing silence of the places that should have become ports of legend, you could feel something missing, like a breath held too long, like a story skipped mid-sentence. Sometimes I'd hear it, not literally, not with my ears, more like a pressure, a pause, like the world itself was waiting for someone to say, "Wait a minute, didn't we forget something?" But no one ever did. Because no one ever notices the moment before the storm, not really. They write songs about battles, coronations, revolutions, but they never sing about the Tuesday afternoon when someone changed their mind and accidentally diverted the future. History's funny that way. It records the fireworks, not the flicker before the fuse. So yeah, that was the turning point. No flags, no drama. Just a quiet, personal decision that never made the papers. One man who stayed ashore, one crown that lost interest, and one ocean that never got its bridge. And while the world kept spinning, it didn't realise it had just missed its biggest appointment. We didn't turn left, we didn't turn right, we just kept walking straight, and never knew what we walked past. Once the dust settled, and by dust I mean that awkward period where people quietly pretended Columbus never had a fan club, Europe did what it always does when it gets nervous. It went back to what it knew, which in this case was the East. You have to understand, the dream of the Indies didn't die with Columbus, it just rerouted. Like a stubborn mule deciding it didn't want to swim today, thank you very much. There were still spices to chase, silk to trade, and porcelain that somehow made European pottery look like a toddler's art project. The appetite didn't change, only the path. So the gaze turned eastward again, across the Mediterranean, through the Arabian deserts, over mountain passes slick with ambition, and at the heart of it all sat the Silk Road, worn, winding, dangerous, and stupidly profitable. Caravans started swelling again. Long trains of camels and mules carrying everything from pepper to rumours. Trade cities buzzed louder than ever. Samarkand, Kashgar, Tabriz, places with names like drumbeats, suddenly felt less like distant myth and more like business partners. Constantinople, still stitched together with gold and stubborn pride, re-emerged as the crown jewel of connection. Europe's gateway to everything vaguely exotic and wildly overpriced. You wanted cinnamon? Go through Constantinople. Gunpowder? Constantinople. That weird blue dye people couldn't shut up about? You guessed it. And while the western ports, Cadiz, Palos, even Lisbon, slowly lost their edge, eastern centres bloomed again. Venice strutted like it had just won a bet. Genoa polished its trade ships. Cairo raised an eyebrow and added another tax. It felt like a return to form, like Europe had flirted with something radical, got ghosted by fate, and ran back to the arms of the East, whispering, "You were right all along." And honestly, it worked. Trade boomed. Courts got their saffron. Scholars got their Arabic translations. Nobles got their fragile, useless tea sets. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was reliable. And in Europe, reliability is the new sexy. The church even got involved again. Sponsored missions, sent envoys, tried converting people by outpraying their shamans. Same old song, different tempo. No one brought up the West anymore, not in polite company. It was considered unsophisticated, a sailor's fantasy, a dead end. Instead, everyone focused on maps that ended in China, on letters from Mongol Khans that were 20 years old and probably fake, on spices that came wrapped in myth and marked up 5 times before they even touched a European dock. And you know what? People were fine with that, because the East was known, mapped, structured. There were systems, alliances, road tolls, and the occasional warlord tax. But at least you had directions. The West, that was a blank page, and Europe decided it had enough mystery for 1 century. So it looked east, steady, focused, profitable, and history just quietly followed. With Spain staring back at the spice trails like a jilted lover begging for relevance, Portugal looked at the situation and did what Portugal always does, adjusted course, trimmed the sails, and went all in on being the quiet powerhouse of maritime ambition. Except now, without Columbus poking at the Western Ocean, there was no Atlantic competition breathing down their necks. No race, no urgency. Just open water, wind, and opportunity, southward. So that's where they went. Africa wasn't new to them. They'd been nibbling down the coast for decades, like a nervous guest tasting unfamiliar food one cautious bite at a time. Trade posts, forts, small alliances, the occasional poorly translated treaty. It was all part of the warm-up act. But now they went full throttle. Prince Henry's ghost practically rose from the grave in excitement. Explorers launched south from Lisbon like arrows from a particularly organised quiver. Cape Verde, the Gold Coast, Benin, Luanda. They charted every inlet, mapped every current, made friends where they could and didn't where they couldn't. And when they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, it wasn't some desperate detour, it was the plan. The Indian Ocean wasn't a mystery anymore, it was a goal. India wasn't just a rumour now, it was a ledger entry, a warehouse waiting to be built. By the time Vasco da Gama showed up, Pepper practically leapt into his cargo hold. Calicut became a negotiation table, not a battlefield. You know what Portugal didn't care about? The Atlantic, the Western Ocean, the so-called edge. They didn't need it. They had Africa, they had India, they had the real Spice Islands, Sumatra, Malacca, Banda, places that sounded like treasure maps and actually delivered. And because Spain was out of the picture, Portugal got the whole lane to themselves. No Treaty of Tordesillas, no line down the globe, no papal referees trying to split continents like birthday cake. It was clean, efficient, strategic, very Portuguese. Their ships got faster, Their cannons got louder, their maps got sharper. Lisbon swelled with foreign goods and gold coins that didn't smell like church tithes. Even their nobles started dressing like they'd seen the world, and in most cases they had. Meanwhile, back across the Atlantic, the waves just kept rolling, unbothered, untouched, no flags planted, no harbours built, no awkward "do you speak Spanish?" first contact moments, just silence. Portugal didn't miss it, not even a little. They were too busy building an ocean empire shaped like a necklace, stringing together ports, islands, and spice like it was all meant to be theirs from the start. And maybe it was. While everyone else kept looking left and getting lost, Portugal looked down, drew a line on the map, and followed it all the way to a global empire. They didn't need to cross the Atlantic to change the world. They just needed to avoid it. It's strange what doesn't happen when one man doesn't sail. Spain never gets its gold. Simple as that. No Aztec plunder, no Incan silver, no armadas hauling mountains of wealth across the Atlantic while sailors die from salted pork and ambition. Without the West to exploit, Spain's so-called golden age never shows up. No gold, no age. Oh sure, they still had castles and swords and a healthy appetite for conquest. But the fuel, the bottomless vault of wealth they would have drained from the New World, that never arrives. No cities paved with stolen treasure. No galleons creaking under the weight of someone else's civilization. No Madrid sparkling like a crown that didn't belong to it. They had to make do with what they had. And honestly, it wasn't much. Instead of leaping into empire status, Spain stayed. Spain. A patchwork of provinces still trying to remember how to get along. Castile and Aragon bickered like exes forced to share a kitchen. Granada was newly conquered, still smouldering from its fall. The nobles were restless. The economy, depressingly local. Without New World gold, the court couldn't fund everything it wanted. No global fleets, no armies marching across Europe with chests full of foreign coin, no palaces plated in illusion. The crown had to say no more often, had to ration dreams. And the church? It still had power, of course. But without mountains of wealth funneled in from forced conversions and silver mines, the Inquisition became more bark than budget. You can't fund a moral crusade on prayer alone. Turns out exorcisms and torture chambers are expensive. Culturally, things dimmed. The Renaissance in Spain never caught fire the way it did elsewhere. Art stayed provincial. Literature stayed stiff. No golden century of Spanish theatre. No Cervantes scribbling in the shadow of empire. Just quiet talent scattered in villages writing for no one. And that language, Spanish, never becomes the world-spanning force it was meant to be. It stays domestic, regional, the lingua franca that never quite leaves the house. Meanwhile, other powers rose. France puffed up its navy. The Ottomans kept their grip strong. And Portugal, bless them, was too busy counting peppercorns in India to even notice Spain sulking at the party. There were still skirmishes, still colonies eventually, in bits and scraps. But the timing was off. The scale, underwhelming. And Spain never became the Titan. Just a nation that could have been. A crown that looked west once, blinked, and missed its moment. You can trace it all back. To a cancelled voyage, a quiet court, an empire that stayed a sketch. No gold from the west, no empire in the east. Just a kingdom waiting for riches that never came. You don't notice what's missing until someone points it out. Like the fact that Italy, in this version of history, never gets tomatoes. Not one. No red sauces, no margarita pizza, no grandmother's ragu simmering on a Sunday while the whole street smells like heaven. Just oil and herbs and the vague sense that something's off. And it's not just the food. Without Columbus or anyone else poking their nose into the Americas, the whole biological swap we now call the Columbian Exchange, it just doesn't happen. Which means no potatoes in Ireland, no chili peppers in India, no vanilla in France, no chocolate anywhere. Let that sink in. Europe never meets cacao. The Swiss never become chocolatiers. Valentine's Day becomes a flour-only affair. Brutal. Meanwhile, over in the Americas, no wheat, no pigs, no measles, no smallpox, no guns, which honestly might have worked out better for everyone involved over there. Their civilizations continue to evolve untouched by plagues and livestock and metal forged for conquest. But let's get back to Europe, because the ripple effects were everywhere. No corn means no feed corn for livestock, which messes with farming, which messes with food supplies, which messes with population growth. History gets weirdly wobbly just from a missing vegetable. And the Great Plains of North America? Still peaceful, still vast, but no horses. None. The wild mustangs that would have run with Comanche and Lakota warriors. They never make it across the Atlantic. That entire chapter of mobility, trade, and mounted resistance simply doesn't right itself. And England? England's still miserable, but for different reasons. No tobacco, no cosy pipe by the fire, no plantations in Virginia, no economic boom from nicotine addiction. The entire gentleman aesthetic, puffing thoughtfully while quoting Shakespeare, cancelled. Coffee still gets around, but it takes longer. Sugar still exists. But those monstrous plantations that fueled half the transatlantic economy, delayed, scaled down, maybe avoided entirely. Slavery, still tragically alive, doesn't become the industrialized hellscape it did in our timeline. Not without those high-maintenance crops demanding constant bodies to burn through. Even the bees missed out. European honeybees never arrived in North America, so their buzzing conquest of the continent never happened. Native pollinators got to keep doing their job uninterrupted. It's like someone unplugged the world's most chaotic blender and left all the ingredients on their respective counters. No exchange, no recipe, just continents staying in their lanes. And sure, maybe dinner was a little blander, maybe medicine moved slower, but so did empire, so did disease, so did greed. And honestly, that might have been worth the trade. So here's what happens when there's no transatlantic scramble, no Spain flexing with Aztec gold, no Portugal stringing forts like pearls across the Americas. The other guys get room to breathe. And by other guys, I mean the powers that never really needed oceans to begin with. The empire's built not on ships and sails, but on cavalry, spice, architecture and ambition so dense it didn't need a coastline to shine. The Ottomans, for starters, they thrive. With no Western colonial thugs poking around, they get the full stage in the Eastern Mediterranean. Trade stays in their orbit. Venice still cuts shady deals with them. Constantinople remains the glittering crossroad, not some half-forgotten detour. They tax the Silk Road. They patrol the Red Sea. They become less of a wall between East and West and more of a golden gate. The empire tightens, centralizes, and doesn't waste time watching its back for a Europe bloated on American silver. And the Mughals? Oh man, they don't just flourish, they bloom. With no Portuguese harassing their ports and no British East India Company plotting 10 steps ahead, the Mughal Empire hits its full stride. Delhi rises not just as a city of marble and miniature paintings, but as a true capital of world culture. Trade with the Middle East flows smoother. Wealth piles up, not drains away. And the art, it gets even more extra. Taj Mahal still happens. Only now it's just the warm-up act. The Safavids in Persia, they hold steady too. Strong borders, rich markets, and fewer European advisors asking suspiciously specific questions about local terrain. Without Europe galloping into every corner of the map with cannonballs and missionary pamphlets, the power balance doesn't tilt, it levels. The empires of the interior stay the empires of the interior. They're not shoved aside by galleons and fake treaties scribbled in Latin. They get to decide their own terms, thank you very much. And let's talk technology. Because now the innovation isn't being hoarded by Europe or funneled into shipbuilding. It spreads east. Gunpowder tech evolves along inland routes. Architecture pushes limits. Mathematics doesn't detour through Portugal. It flows through Baghdad, Delhi, and Samarkand. What's missing is the disruption. That jagged edge of colonialism that carved through half the planet like it was unpaid woodwork. Without it, things stabilize. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but with way less looting and flag planting. It's a different kind of global power. One built on rivers and caravans, not conquest and caravel. And in this version of the world, the Ottomans never declined so fast. The Mughals don't get broken into provinces and auctioned off. The heart of the world doesn't shift west. It pulses steadily in the middle. Turns out, if Europe doesn't sail past its reach, the rest of the world doesn't get shoved aside. It stands tall, and history starts looking very, very different. The funny thing about history is how fragile empires look in hindsight. Paper tigers, stretched too thin, already halfway to collapse. That's how people like to explain the fall of the Aztecs. But what if no one ever showed up to push? No sails on the horizon, no pale strangers asking for gold, no steel swords, no horses, no disease wrapped in a handshake. Tenochtitlan never falls, it grows. You've probably seen the paintings. This shining island city, causeways stretching across the lake like stone arms, canals glittering in the sun. But those images always come with a tragic footnote. This was before, well, not this time. Without conquistadors barging in like chaos with a travel budget, the Aztec Empire has space to breathe. It's not peaceful, sure. They were never shy about warfare, but they're in control. The enemies they face are ones they know. Rival city-states, border rebellions, the occasional unruly priest. Nothing they can't handle. And as the decades roll on, things shift. The empire reforms. Slowly, rituals get revised. Tribute systems evolve. Old enemies get absorbed, not erased. And Tenochtitlan, it becomes more than capital. It becomes myth in motion. A city that doesn't just survive, it learns. They expand south, east, maybe even north. The deserts become mapped. The jungle paths fortified. Trade routes stretch further, carrying obsidian, cocoa, feathers, and stories of a city on the lake that outlived its doom. Technology keeps moving too. There's no plundered Europe flooding the Americas with iron and muskets. But that doesn't mean stagnation. The Aztecs had engineers, astronomers, people who could read stars and calendars better than half the kings in Europe. Given time, given peace, that knowledge grows, innovates, multiplies. Agriculture scales up. The Chinampas, those floating gardens, become full agricultural systems. Cities sprout along the lake systems like constellations. Art flourishes. Codices are written and passed down, not burned. And here's the part that really bends the map. By the time any outsider does arrive, some stray explorer blown off course or a rogue trader looking for furs, they don't meet a crumbling empire on the brink. They meet a powerhouse, a nation that's organized, literate, spiritually unified, and not particularly impressed with the strangers and their clunky ships. Diplomacy becomes possible. Trade, maybe. But conquest? Not so much. Because this time, there's no smallpox, no betrayal, no Cortez pretending to be a god. Just a thriving, complex civilization that never got interrupted. And in this version of the story, the lake still sparkles. The city still stands. The empire isn't a cautionary tale told in footnotes and museum exhibits. It's a chapter that keeps going. Tenochtitlan, alive, unbroken, and finally given the chance to become what it was always meant to be. The Andes were never quiet. People think of them as these towering, empty backdrops, majestic, sure, but still. But no. The Andes were alive. They hummed with footsteps, with messengers, with cities carved into cliffsides and kings who ruled from the sky. And the Inca, they didn't just live there, they owned it. Their roads were the veins of the mountains, stone-laid highways stretching across impossible terrain, linking deserts to jungles, coasts to peaks. Runners moved along them like thoughts through a mind, carrying messages, goods, and orders with a rhythm the empire could trust. In our world, those roads were just getting started. Then the Spanish came, and everything fell. But in this version, no one arrives, no steel, no cavalry, no unfamiliar gods demanding temples be torn down. Just time, precious, uninterrupted time. So the roads keep going. Further north, past where they used to stop, past Quito, past mountains that were once boundaries and now become bridges. The Inca don't just defend, they expand, not in a mad rush, but in that slow, deliberate way that lasts. They send diplomats, not just soldiers. Offer grain in one hand, authority in the other. And most people take the deal. It's safer that way. Technology, meanwhile, finds its groove. Terraces become more than farming tools. They become laboratories. People start experimenting with altitude, with climate. Potatoes are bred to survive nearly anything. Quinoa isn't trendy health food. It's empire fuel. Machu Picchu doesn't fall into mystery. It becomes a retreat for scholars and priests. A place where astronomy and statecraft blur. The stars are red. The calendar's refined. And the empire keeps ticking like a stone clock. Without foreign diseases tearing through their population, the Inca don't lose 3/4 of their people in a decade. They don't have to rebuild from ash. They just keep going. More cities, more roads, more knowledge passed from father to son, priest to apprentice, elder to child. They experiment with metallurgy, copper, bronze, even early alloys. Their knotted cords, the quipu, evolve. Not just record-keeping anymore, maybe even language. Systems, logic, the building blocks of something bigger. And when they finally do meet foreigners, traders blown in from Asia or explorers from the north, they meet them as equals. No panic, no collapse. Just curious people in high places, ready to negotiate. The empire becomes something Europe never got to see. A civilization built not on interruption, but on intention. And the roads? They're still there, still stretching. Not as ruins, not as tourist sites, but as lifelines, beating out the rhythm of an empire that never got cut short. An empire that never had to look over its shoulder, only forward. People forget North America had cities, real ones. With pyramids, central plazas, earthworks so massive you can still see them from the air today, even though most people can't name them. Cahokia, for example, right near where St. Louis is now. It wasn't just a town, it was a metropolis. Tens of thousands of people, temples, trade routes, a skyline made of mounds and wood and vision. But history skipped it, because by the time European eyes looked that way, the city had already emptied out, its reasons swallowed by time and the quiet erosion of memory. Except in this version of the story, no one arrives to write over it. No disease to sweep through the river valleys. No guns traded for land, no treaties signed under duress and burned in silence. Just space and time, and people who already knew what they were doing. So Cahokia doesn't vanish, it evolves. Maybe it declines for a while, maybe leadership shifts, but the network, the ideas, they survive. The rivers remain the highways, trade intensifies, not just corn and pottery, but stories, alliances, calendars. Ideas move faster than empires. And in the northeast, the Haudenosaunee, what you might know as the Iroquois Confederacy, they thrive. They were already brilliant at politics, built their entire society on balance and negotiation, long before Europe figured out how to elect anyone without a fistfight. The great law of peace wasn't just idealistic, it worked. And now, uninterrupted, it grows. The 5 nations become 6, then 8. The Confederacy expands, pulling in neighbours, stabilising borders. Warfare becomes ritualised. Diplomacy becomes formalised. Power starts concentrating, but not into a crown, into a council, into wisdom. By the time anyone from the outside world lands on a North American shore, and it takes a while, they don't find scattered tribes. They find nations, confederacies, coalitions, people with flags, languages, and very clear opinions about sovereignty. And trade, it's booming. Copper from the Great Lakes, shell beads from the coasts, bison hides from the plains, everything moving through hands that understand value. No exploitation, no discovery, just commerce, carried on canoes and spoken in languages Europeans never bothered to learn in our version. Cahokia becomes a cultural capital. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy becomes a diplomatic force. Other nations, Choctaw, Anishinaabe, Salish, Dene, grow, adapt, thrive. The continent doesn't stay static. It innovates, learns from its mistakes, builds upward and outward, not under pressure but under sunlight. And the North America that rises, it doesn't wait to be found. It was already there. It just needed to be left alone long enough to remember how to shine. The thing people forget about culture, real living, breathing culture is that it doesn't just survive in isolation. It flourishes when it's allowed to grow without being overwritten, without being discovered, without being translated out of its own voice. And so, without ships full of strangers crashing onto unfamiliar shores, the Americas keep their voices. All of them. There's no one dominant language, no colonizer's tongue flattening everything into syllables it can pronounce. What you get instead is a continent that sounds like a woven tapestry, each thread distinct, all of it humming. Over in the north, you've got Haudenosaunee still spoken, still evolving. Not frozen in time, not cut short, just living. It picks up new words, borrows ideas, adapts to the politics of a growing confederacy. It becomes a language of diplomacy, of law, of poetry. The Anishinaabe tongues keep flowing like the rivers they travel. Lakota, Diné, Cree, they don't vanish. They diversify. Some dialects split, some merge, others develop entirely new branches. Language isn't static. It bends with need. And now there's time for that bending. Out west, Chinook jargon becomes more than a trade pidgin. It matures into a regional lingua franca, used in markets, councils, love letters. Navajo becomes more abstract, more mathematical, a tool for astronomy, for philosophy, for things that were never allowed to bloom in our version of events. Further south, Nahuatl doesn't get reduced to museum labels. It becomes the voice of an Aztec renaissance. Tenochtitlan produces playwrights, scientists, theologians, all speaking a language that stayed whole. Maya glyphs aren't lost to fire. They're refined, passed down, taught, written across the walls of universities built in jungle cities that never collapsed, because no one came to dismantle them. Even isolated languages, those spoken by a few villages in the highlands or along the river bends deep in the Amazon, don't get erased. They keep their rhythm, their songs, their prayers, and they're not preserved like butterflies pinned to a board. They're spoken, laughed in, cursed in, lived in. The result? A continent where language isn't a barrier, it's a badge. People grow up bilingual, trilingual, polylingual without blinking. It's not exotic, it's just normal. Communication isn't about assimilation, it's about translation, listening, understanding across differences, not erasing them. It's messy, sure, but beautiful. And without that wave of European civilization crashing in, there's no pressure to flatten it all. No pressure to pick a language and shove everything else into the attic. So it stays, all of it. The 1,000 names for river, the 100 ways to say peace, the words for sky that don't need to be translated because they already mean what they mean. And the continent? It doesn't speak with one voice. It sings with 1,000. You'd be amazed what doesn't happen when one cough doesn't cross the ocean. No measles, no smallpox, no invisible armies smuggled in on ships and blankets, no fever that wipes out villages before anyone even knows the rules have changed. And because of that, the Americas stay full of people, of families, of elders who live long enough to pass down everything they know, of children who don't grow up surrounded by silence. There's no great dying, no mountains of unburied bodies, no priests running out of graves to dig, no sudden erasure of generations before they could tell you where the sacred stone should go, or which plant heals which wound, or why the stars matter more in autumn. 80%. That's the number some historians toss around for how many indigenous people were lost in the first century after contact. Not to war, not to conquest, but to germs. 80%. Now imagine they lived. Imagine what happens when every village remains whole, when every city keeps its momentum, when knowledge doesn't get severed by plague, when empires like the Inca and the Mexica don't have to rebuild from a fraction of their former strength, because they never fell. Suddenly, history has mass. It has resistance. The Americas aren't soft clay for colonizers to shape. They're fortified, politically, culturally, demographically. You don't push over a civilization when its people are still standing shoulder to shoulder. Even smaller nations, the ones that lived between the cracks of empire, remain strong enough to defend themselves. The Tupi, the Mapuche, the Mississippians, They don't vanish into footnotes. They negotiate. They form leagues. They learn from their neighbours, not from their conquerors. And when outsiders eventually arrive, because someone always does, they don't meet devastation. They meet complexity. Societies that have had centuries to expand, invent, experiment. Systems that are intact. People who are healthy, curious, cautious, but not broken. And maybe trade happens. Maybe new crops arrive. Maybe iron is passed hand to hand, not dropped at the tip of a sword, because disease isn't there to tip the scales. There's no silent genocide clearing the board. Instead, it's a conversation, a cautious dance, cultures meeting without one of them bleeding out before the first word is spoken. And the land itself, it stays cultivated, managed, cared for. The forests don't swallow up empty towns. The rivers don't run past abandoned farms. Everything stays lived in. That's the part we forget. It wasn't the conquest that cleared the path for empire. It was the coughing. So now, no disease, no collapse. Just a world where the people who built the pyramids, who tracked the stars, who named the rivers before we ever saw them, never stopped building, never stopped living, and never had to bury their future in the ground before it even arrived. It started with sails on the horizon, but not the kind Europe was stitching together. These were different, massive, red silk catching the wind like it had somewhere important to be. Hulls carved like floating temples, sterns higher than rooftops. They moved slow but proud, like they already owned whatever coast they were about to touch. Ming sails. In the 1500s they crossed the Pacific. Not by accident, not blown off course, but on purpose. A calculated, imperial experiment. One more ribbon added to a network of trade and tribute that already stretched from Java to Zanzibar. And this time they reached California. Imagine it. That soft Pacific fog rolling back to reveal ships unlike anything the western coast had ever seen. Not conquistadors with desperation in their eyes. Not fur traders with half-maps and cold fingers. But a full-fledged maritime expedition. Organised, diplomatic, richly provisioned, and entirely uninterested in conquest. When they landed, it wasn't with cannons drawn or flags stabbed into the soil. It was with gifts. Porcelain, silk, dried tea pressed into tight little bricks. They didn't claim, they asked. And what they found? A continent still full, still strong. Nations with their own systems, cities inland, languages layered like topsoil. The locals weren't in awe, they were curious. The ships were strange, the visitors even stranger. But it wasn't a meeting of gods and mortals. It was just people, looking at each other across centuries of separation. The Ming emissaries took notes, met with coastal leaders, traded. They weren't here to settle, just to understand, to map, maybe to establish a post, something small near a river mouth, a place to leave gifts, a place to return to. Word spread fast, up the coast, inland. Newcomers had arrived, not to rule, but to talk. And because the continent hadn't been broken by disease or war, it had the structure to respond. Councils formed, delegations travelled. People negotiated not out of desperation, but from strength. And back in China, the court took interest. The emperor wasn't sure what to make of it at first. A new land? Fine. But was there jade? Was there tribute? Were the stars favourable? Eventually curiosity won. Another voyage was planned, this time with scholars, cartographers, and more tea. California became a whisper in imperial records. Not as a colony, not as a conquest, but as a curiosity. A distant cousin, a mirror across the sea. And while Europe still argued over spices and scriptural borders, two ancient civilizations, one ocean apart, shared rice and stories under red lanterns hung from cypress branches. It didn't spark a gold rush. It didn't rewrite every map overnight. But it was the start of something slower, softer. A history built not on war, but on wonder. And somewhere near what we now call Monterey, there's a story passed down about the day the sea brought strangers. Not with swords, but with silk. And how for once no one had to bleed for it. They always said it was just a story. Vinland, a land to the west full of grapes and grass, where the winters didn't bite as hard and the soil didn't punish you for planting. It was the kind of tale you told over ale, halfway between history and hallucination. Everyone knew Leif Erikson had gone somewhere, but nobody really cared where, because nobody went back. Until they did. It started slow, like all things up north. A curiosity here, a ship right there, someone digging through sagas and thinking, what if we weren't drunk? What if we just forgot? So they built new ships, not raiding vessels, not warboats, but sturdy, stubborn things with wide bellies and high hopes. And they sailed west, not to find glory or gold or God, but to chase an echo. And this time they found it. Vinland. A real place. Cold at the edges, sure, but green inland. Rich with trees, rivers, animals that hadn't learned to be afraid yet. And untouched. No colonies, no flags, no poisoned treaties waiting in the bushes. The Norse didn't conquer. That wasn't the plan. They set up camp, built huts, fished, traded, waited to see who might come out of the forest. And when the locals finally did, it wasn't with fear. They'd heard stories too, of strange men with braided beards who once came, fought and vanished. But this time there was no fighting. Just fires, fish, and a lot of confused hand gestures. Over the years the stories stopped being stories. They became logs, charts, real maps passed from hand to hand in Bergen, in Reykjavik, in Trondheim. Vinland was no longer a myth. It was a destination. The trade grew, slowly. Furs, wood, dried fish, herbs with names the Norse couldn't pronounce, and in return, iron tools, wool, honey, nothing massive, nothing empire-breaking, just the kind of slow, respectful exchange that happens when neither side is desperate. Eventually, settlements stuck, not cities, outposts, with long houses, carved poles, and names that bent Old Norse into something softer. Kids grew up speaking two languages, mixing mythologies, drawing suns the Norse way, and moons like the locals did. And maybe that was the most important part. For once, exploration didn't erase what came before. It added to it. Because the Norse remembered Vinland. And this time, they stayed. They were late. Not fashionably late. Centuries late. By the time England finally got its act together and pointed a few creaky ships across the Atlantic, it was 1650. They were tangled in their own mess back home. Civil war, executed kings, Puritans yelling about everything. Not exactly an ideal launchpad for colonial greatness. Still, they came. Salt-crusted, underfunded, and a little too confident. They expected wilderness, empty land, scattered tribes, maybe a few confused villagers with feathers and a vague idea of European trade. What they got instead? Borders, roads, diplomats who spoke in metaphors and mathematics. By 1650, the indigenous nations of the Americas weren't waiting to be discovered. They were running things. Federations had formed, agreements had been made, trade routes spanned rivers and mountains. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy stretched further than any English map showed. The Mississippian cities had rebuilt, risen again, and learned how to speak with one voice. The Mexica and Inca empires had merged science with tradition, and their influence reached deep into the northern forests and far beyond the Andes. So when the English ships dropped anchor and stumbled ashore, it wasn't with shock and awe. It was with awkward introductions and a quick realization they weren't in charge here. The first meeting didn't happen on a battlefield or in a smoky tavern. It happened in a council hall made of cedar and stone, where the delegation from England sat across from a dozen leaders who didn't blink. The English started with the usual pitch. God, trade, opportunity, all wrapped in a neat accent and too much lace. But the response wasn't fear. It was negotiation. Terms, boundaries, a list of what would and wouldn't be tolerated. And here's the part that rattled them. They had to listen. Because these nations weren't fragile. They weren't sick. They weren't scattered. They were organized, informed, and completely unamused by the idea of anyone showing up uninvited. England wanted fur. They'd need to trade fairly. Wanted land. Good luck. Every parcel had a name, a story, and someone willing to fight for it. Wanted to spread religion? Better hope your sermons translated well, because these people already had centuries of theology tucked into their calendars. There were no easy victories, no desperate conversions, no clever manipulations through food or firearms. Every move was watched, measured, answered. The English didn't retreat. They weren't good at quitting, but they adjusted. Fast. The settlers that stayed weren't conquerors, they were tenants, visitors, people who knew they were walking on someone else's terms. History didn't unfold the way it was supposed to. There were no 13 colonies, no quick domination, no illusion of superiority. There was diplomacy, friction, learning, patience, sometimes forced at the tip of a spear. By the end of the decade, England still had its outposts, but they weren't ruling anything. They were guests, and if they forgot that, even once, they didn't last long. By the time the real first contact happened, the kind with pens and treaties, not swords and smoke, the world had aged into something more thoughtful, not perfect, not peaceful, just older, wiser maybe, tired of burning things down to make a point. It wasn't Columbus, wasn't Cortez or Cabot or any of the names history loves to carve into bronze. This time it was a philosopher's son, an astronomer's apprentice, a crew of map-makers, linguists and botanists sent not by an empire hungry for land, but by a republic curious about life. The ship came with a printing press instead of a priest, ink, not gunpowder, a trunk full of translated texts, Newton, Galileo, a Quran, a Torah, a copy of the Popol Vuh someone had found in a sealed library in Tenochtitlan and sent back across the ocean as a gesture of goodwill. They landed on the coast near what would have been Virginia, but in this version it wasn't a name waiting to be given. It already had one, ancient, layered, shaped by the tide and the people who fished its waters long before maps tried to freeze it. No musket lines, no ambushes, just a small delegation waiting on the sand, dressed in bark cloth and copper, with eyes that had seen ships before, but never ones that arrived without claiming anything. The meeting didn't happen in Latin or Algonquian. It happened in silence mostly. Gestures, smiles, patience, a shared fruit, a borrowed word, a child pointing at the stars and saying something that made everyone pause. The Europeans brought instruments, sextants, telescopes, portable clocks. The hosts brought questions, not about what the strangers wanted, but what they saw, what they knew about the sky, the soil, the stories. Days passed, then weeks, and instead of settlements there were conversations. Instead of missions there were schools, shared camps where herbalists taught each other about roots, and scribes compared writing systems under firelight. There was friction, sure, culture shock, missteps. Someone offered roasted dog at one point and the botanist from Antwerp fainted. But there was no collapse, no mass burial, no villages torched because someone sneezed in the wrong direction, because conquest wasn't the goal. Curiosity was. And slowly, something rare began to form. Not an empire, not even an alliance, just a recognition that this world split by oceans and myth might not need to be stitched together by blood. That knowledge could move without chains, that gods could sit next to each other in stories and not start wars, and that the moment of first contact didn't have to be a scar. It could be a beginning, not louder than the past, just softer and finally heard. It's hard to explain what didn't happen. There's no auction blocks, no chains rusting in museum corners, no ledger books filled with names turned into numbers, no stolen children growing up with someone else's language stitched into their mouths. Because in this world, the Atlantic slave trade never starts. No sugar colonies needing bodies to burn through. No plantations measuring worth in broken backs. No ship owners arguing margins over human cargo. The triangle never forms, because the westward push that powered it, the hunger for endless land and free labour, never gains momentum. And so Africa stays, not untouched, not some perfect paradise, but whole, connected. Empires rise and fall, yes, but on their own terms. The Songhai still expand, the Kingdom of Congo still trades, The Yoruba still build cities with wars and gods and poetry. But there's no coastal collapse, no kingdoms cannibalizing their neighbours just to survive European demand. No inland panic as captives vanish toward a horizon no one comes back from. The coast remains a place of commerce, not capture. The rivers don't become highways for misery. Forts become markets. Ships carry goods, not ghosts. And the people? They live. Millions of them. Unbroken. They farm, they build, they write, they remember. Lineages stretch unbroken. Names stay in families. Songs don't get lost between generations. No culture flattened. No faith outlawed. No rhythm repackaged and sold back centuries later. The diaspora never gets carved into fragments. There's no forced scattering. No continent echoing with questions like, where are we from? Because no one ever tore out the answer in the first place. In the Americas, the plantations never rise. Sugar stays rare. Tobacco is a curiosity, not a currency. The labour model shifts. Smaller farms, different crops, slower growth. No mass import of violence disguised as economics. The gears of capitalism turn slower, and maybe that's a good thing. Without slavery as fuel, the machinery of empire sputters. Fewer ships, fewer conquests, more negotiation, less brutality packaged as progress. And in Africa, wealth accumulates, not from conquest but from continuity. Ivory, gold, textiles, scholars, still traded, still prized, but not extracted like marrow, not drained to build someone else's palace. The ports of West Africa shine in copper and carved stone. Children learn to write in their native scripts. Timbuktu's libraries double in size. And somewhere in a village far from the coast, a grandmother teaches her grandson the same lullaby her grandmother once sang, because nobody ever took her away. And the world, quieter now, still moving, still flawed, learns to build wealth without theft, power without chains. Freedom isn't a revolution here, it's just normal. And it always was. It started with a boat, like so many stories do, but not the kind that carried soldiers or silver or royal decrees. This one was quiet, painted in soft colours, its hull curved like a crescent moon. Inside were monks, robed in saffron, heads shaved, eyes wide with awe. They didn't land with banners, no choirs, no salutes, just bare feet touching warm sand and the sound of a bell, softly rung, just once, as if to say, we're here now. The mission wasn't about conversion, not in the way Europe had done it. There were no threats, no eternal damnation hanging over anyone's head. The monks weren't here to erase. They were here to offer, to listen. They made their way inland, past jungle and river, up into the highlands of what we now call Mexico. They were invited. Curiosity will do that. The locals had heard of these strangers, travellers from across a vast ocean, who spoke slowly, moved deliberately, and carried no weapons. That alone made them interesting. When they reached the capital, Tenochtitlan still gleaming, still alive, they didn't demand an audience. They waited outside the temple, sat in stillness. Days passed. They didn't fidget, didn't chant, just breathed. Eventually, someone asked what they were doing. One of the monks, an older man with hands like driftwood, looked up and smiled. Listening to the gods, he said. Yours and ours. That was the beginning. What followed wasn't a takeover, it was a weaving. Aztec priests sat with Buddhist scribes. They compared calendars, stories, cycles. They debated karma and maize, talked about sacrifice and suffering. And somewhere between the fire and the lotus, something new emerged. Not Buddhism, not Nahua religion, but a hybrid, slow-growing and deeply rooted. Temples began to appear with curved rooftops and serpent carvings. Incense smoke curled through prayer halls, where chants blended Nahuatl with Sanskrit. Meditation was taught not as an escape, but as a way to listen. To the earth, to the ancestors, to the rain god who still held sway over the seasons. Children learned both creation myths. Both had jaguars, both had silence. The new philosophy didn't erase pain or end conflict, but it changed how people understood it. Suffering wasn't punishment, it was passage. Warriors still trained, But now they studied breath between battles. Merchants began to leave offerings not just for profit, but for balance. Even the rulers changed. Not dramatically, but their tone softened. The word emperor slowly shifted toward caretaker. And when other nations heard about the monks from the east, they didn't send armies. They sent questions. What do they teach? What do they believe? Why are their cities so calm? No one built an empire with it. That was never the goal. But across the continent, something began to shift. People started sitting in silence before speaking, started planting trees near temples, started leaving bowls of water for strangers who passed by. And if you asked where it came from, someone might smile and say, a boat with no swords and a bell. Just once, softly. As if to say, we're still here. No towers, no tunnels, no honking taxis or bagels or buildings scratching at the sky like they're trying to pull the stars down. Just trees. For miles. Where New York would have stood, where glass and steel were meant to rise, there's forest. Thick, layered, alive. The Hudson River still runs, slow and wide, carving its quiet line through a landscape that never got paved over. Deer drink from its banks. Otters chase each other across smooth stones. And if you stand on the cliffs where a skyscraper was supposed to go, you can see eagles. Actual eagles. Nesting. There's no Manhattan here. No grid. No Wall Street. The Dutch never built their fort. The English never renamed anything. The Lenape never lost the land under their feet. Instead, they still live there. Not unchanged. Just unbroken. The villages grew slowly, nestled where the river bends, protected by rock and tradition. Trade routes evolved, paths through pine, canoe crossings, seasonal markets on the open shores. Knowledge passed from clan to clan, about stars, about roots, about how to live in a place without trying to own it. And the forest? It flourished. The kind of deep generational flourishing that only happens when nobody shows up with saws and blueprints. There are trails here, but no highways. Campsites, but no condos. When people gather, it's in circles, not skyscrapers. Their stories stretch longer than lease agreements. Their names mean something. The land never got bought, so nothing ever got sold. No Ellis Island, no Statue of Liberty. No promise whispered in the ears of the tired and the poor as they stepped off boats and into tenements. No melting pot, no jazz born in back rooms, no subways rattling under poetry and pigeons. And yet, there is still life here, culture, celebration. But it doesn't tower. It flows, with the river, with the wind through the canopy, with songs sung in languages that never had to fit inside English grammar. Somewhere, on a cool morning, a teenager sits on a riverbank with a carved flute in their lap. They play a tune handed down by their grandfather. It's a song about the water and the birds, and the way the trees lean just slightly westward, as if they too remember something that never happened. It's not silence here, not emptiness, just space, breathing room, a pause that never got interrupted. New York was never built, and the world found other ways to shine. Without America in the mix, the world didn't stop spinning. It just spun differently. No United States meant no dollar to anchor the globe. No Wall Street pulling strings behind the curtain. No Silicon Valley pouring code into every crack of the internet. No sudden boom powered by stolen land and endless labor. The gears of the global economy still turned. But the engine, that was somewhere else entirely. It started with the empires that never got trampled. China never had to face a century of humiliation. No opium wars, no spheres of influence, no gunboats docking in Shanghai demanding deals. The Qing dynasty, still imperfect, still bureaucratic as ever, kept humming. Their exports, porcelain, silk, tea, flowed steadily along well-tended trade networks. But now, they weren't just vendors in someone else's marketplace. They were the marketplace. Paper currency got refined. Maritime law evolved from Confucian principles and coastal necessity. Chinese banks, not European ones, became the backbone of international credit. If you wanted to build a railway in this world, chances are you negotiated with a merchant in Guangzhou, not a financier in London. India? Same deal. No East India Company to puppet string its fate. No colonial clamps on its economy. The Mughal legacy stayed strong long enough for a new form of governance to rise, less feudal, more federated. Textile cities like Surat and Dhaka never collapsed under British tariffs. Instead, they expanded, innovated. Indian math met Persian architecture, met Southeast Asian trade routes. Currency stabilized. Gold flowed in, not out. And by the 1800s, Mumbai and Delhi weren't colonies. They were capitals, not just of nations, of systems. And then there were the Ottomans. In our world, they faltered, too slow to modernize, too tangled in European games. But in this one, they didn't have to keep up with a runaway West powered by Atlantic conquest. They were the balance. Constantinople, still vibrant, still strategically placed, remained a crossroads of silk, spices, metals, and ideas. Sharia-based commercial law adapted to global needs. Trade caravans were protected, efficient, and taxed just enough to keep roads clear and cities safe. Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, they weren't backdrops. They were the engine rooms of the middle world. And Africa? Still intact. Still whole. Coastal empires traded on their terms. The gold from Mali flowed east, not west. The Swahili coast connected Arabia, India, and the interior in a steady, respectful rhythm. There were no stolen centuries. No pillaged bodies to bankroll someone else's idea of prosperity. Europe, for once, wasn't the default winner. It was part of the chorus. Still important. Still loud. But no longer conducting the symphony. The world had multiple centers now, multiple currencies, multiple truths about how value moved through space. And when a new technology emerged, a better way to weave cloth, or chart the stars, or calculate interest, it didn't need to be rubber-stamped in London or Paris. It could come from Delhi, or Hangzhou, or Istanbul, and the world would listen. Because in this version of history, America never took the throne. It simply stayed, over the horizon, and the world moved on without it. The 20th century didn't roar, it whispered. No atomic flash over Japan. No superpower showdowns. No proxy wars in jungles people couldn't find on a map. Without America stepping onto the world stage with its factories, bombs, and boundless self-confidence, history took a different route. Slower, softer, and for once, quieter. This was the Pacific century, but not the one we were supposed to have. Power didn't blast outward from the west. It rippled from the east. Technology, too. But instead of Silicon Valley, it came from Seoul, from Kyoto, from Chengdu and Jakarta. Innovation spread not with conquest, but conversation. Ideas didn't arrive in warships. They floated in on trade winds. China had the infrastructure, roads, ports, entire cities built to process, distribute, refine. The government wasn't perfect, what government ever is, but it worked. Bureaucrats who studied classical texts by candlelight were now managing international science councils. Their focus, efficiency, harmony, balance. Korea rose next. Without being wedged between global empires, it found its own stride, developed metallurgy, glasswork, later computers. The peninsula became a tech corridor, not a battlefield. Universities flourished, electricity came early, and the internet, it wasn't a product, it was a public good. Japan, of course, had always known how to adapt. In this world, it didn't get nuked, didn't get remade in someone else's image. Its industrial revolution wasn't forced, it was chosen, carefully, culturally. They took what worked, left what didn't, and skipped the guilt. By the time the world needed processors, robotics, and compact energy systems, Japan was already shipping them, wrapped in minimal packaging naturally. And Polynesia? Still scattered, still small, but no longer forgotten. Their knowledge of navigation, of stars and sea currents, became a foundation for entire networks of oceanic trade and communication. Fibre optic cables laid by catamaran, weather systems predicted by elders and satellites. Even places the West used to call remote found purpose. The Philippines became a medical hub, Vietnam, a clean energy pioneer. Micronesia hosted the first trans-Pacific quantum relay. Each piece of the map mattered now, because in this version of the Pacific century, nobody needed to conquer to be heard. They just needed to connect. Meanwhile, Europe sat politely on the sidelines. Not irrelevant, just retired from the global referee role. Its museums stayed full, its cities stayed charming, and its governments finally had the time to fix their plumbing. And America? Still there. Still vast, but not a force, not a brand, just land. Forests untouched, plains unpaved. A people who never lost what they were to someone else's idea of greatness. In this world, knowledge didn't come with a price tag. Progress wasn't a race, it was a rhythm. Shared, circulated, honoured. The century didn't end with a bang or a banner on the moon. It ended with a sunrise over the Pacific. And the world just kept turning. In peace. In balance. In time. The Renaissance still happened. There were still domes and frescoes. Still poets writing about love and decay. Still sculptors who believed marble could bleed if you carved it just right. But something was missing. Something quiet. Something sweet. Something no one in Florence or Venice even knew they were supposed to crave. There was no chocolate. No thick, dark cups sipped in candle-lit studies. No cocoa dust on the lips of painters pulling all-nighters. No tiny bars handed to children wrapped in foil and joy, because the Americas stayed untouched. And cacao, the sacred seed of gods, never made the journey. So the Renaissance bloomed. Bitter. Not sad, not dull, just different. Instead of chocolate, Europeans reached deeper into their own soil. Fig trees took centre stage. Honey stayed king. Almond milk flowed freely in kitchens from Valencia to Naples. And spices. They still mattered. But they came slowly, wrapped in silk and risk, from the east. There was no chili either. No pepper that danced on the tongue and set kitchens alight with possibility. So they leaned into other heat. Mustard, horseradish, vinegars so sharp they felt like arguments. Dishes had fewer explosions and more shadows, flavour that crept, not struck. And corn, maize stayed on the other side of the ocean. No golden fields stretching across Europe, no polenta in the north, no cornbread at the table. Wheat held its ground. Barley never left. Rye got creative. The grains that once stood quietly in the background took the spotlight. They became the flavour. Peasants still baked bread, but it stayed dark, dense and local. No cornmeal to stretch the dough, no fried maize cakes sizzling on clay. Just hard crusts and soft centres and the patience of 1,000 hands that never knew there was another way. Tomatoes never showed up either. But that's a story for another time. And yet, despite all that wasn't, there was still beauty. The Renaissance didn't need chocolate to ask big questions. Galileo still looked up. Brunelleschi still reached for heaven with bricks and balance. Machiavelli still ruined every dinner party with his political takes. They painted with wine, not cocoa. Toasted almonds instead of sipping mole. Their sweet was fruit and honey, not sugar-laced perfection from across the sea. And when someone wept over a symphony or a sculpture, or the scent of fresh rosemary drifting through a stone window, they didn't know what they were missing. How could they? The Renaissance without chocolate wasn't broken. It just tasted different, richer in salt, leaner in luxury, like a love letter written in ink instead of velvet. And it was still beautiful, just bittersweet in a way no one realised. No Elvis, no Little Richard, no garage band changing the world from a basement in Liverpool, no vinyl with too much bass, no leather jackets, screaming teens, or guitars slung low like rebellion itself. In this world, there's no rock and roll, and the silence it leaves behind is louder than you'd think. It's not that music disappears, far from it. Humans don't stop making sound just because the backbeat never arrives. But everything feels different. The energy's not gone. It's just rearranged, redirected, rewritten in a different key. Without American culture blasting itself into every speaker and screen from Tokyo to Turin, music stays more local, more rooted. No single genre rises to swallow the world. No British invasion, No Woodstock. No global soundtrack built from the blues of Mississippi, the gospel of Georgia, and the rhythm of Black America turned into something new, loud, and universal. So instead, the world diversifies. In Mali, the kora becomes the centerpiece of a global fusion movement, not sampled by outsiders but led from within. Songs stretch like rivers, layered and trance-like. Entire genres evolve around polyrhythms and oral epics. In India, ragas go electric. Sitar bands headline festivals. The tabla isn't background, it's lead. Bollywood still sings, but now its sound spills across borders, not from mimicry, but momentum. In Japan, taiko drumming merges with synth. The music's fast, disciplined, huge, not rebellious, ritualistic, like a dance you rehearse until it burns into your bones. Europe gets weird, but in a different way. Without American radio flooding every airwave, folk traditions never get pushed aside. Finnish throat singing meets German minimalism. French chanson doesn't retreat, it gets louder. Accordions, violins, hand claps, music for streets, not stadiums. Even in England the blues never arrives, so skiffle bands don't morph into rock legends. The Beatles become session players, not cultural detonators. Punk never punches through. Glam stays underground. David Bowie sells out a few theatres, not the planet. And without rock and roll there's no template for cool. No teenage rebellion on vinyl. No idea that music should shake you loose from your parents, your past, or your politics. Instead, music becomes more about place. More regional dialect than universal anthem. People dance differently, dress differently. They don't share a chorus, they hum their own. And that's not a bad thing. The world doesn't get smaller. It stays big, messy, musical in ways that don't translate neatly. Because without rock and roll, there's no single frequency uniting the planet, just thousands of signals, broadcasting, alive, and everyone, everywhere still taps their foot to something. It just doesn't sound like yours. They didn't write in English. They didn't have to. The great novels of this world, the books, the ones whispered about by firelight and debated in sunlit terraces above cloud-choked valleys, were carved in mountain breath, written in Quechua, in Nahuatl, in Aymara. Words shaped by altitude, by stone, by centuries of listening to gods with volcano voices. They didn't call them novels at first. They called them threads, stories woven, not just told. A tradition that began long before ink, back when histories were tied into quipus and passed between hands that knew how to read with fingertips. But over time, the thread became the page. And what emerged was unlike anything from Europe's salons or Asia's imperial courts. These weren't books written to conquer shelves. They were stories rooted in the land, literature shaped by maize and jaguars, by thunder that echoed across stone cities no invader ever reached. One of the first great epics was Pachacuti, written entirely in Quechua. It wasn't about kings or war. It was about time folding in on itself, about a woman who could hear the thoughts of rivers and a city that aged backwards, 1,000 pages long, no chapters, just breath after breath. Scholars still argue whether it was fiction, history, or scripture. Then came Texacotl in Nahuatl, a political drama that unfolded over the length of a single eclipse. The entire plot takes place inside a royal kitchen, while a plot to change the empire simmers, both metaphorically and literally, in clay pots. The dialogue is sharp. The metaphors are layered like obsidian. It's been translated 50 times and never once improved. Later in Aymara, a novel emerged called Chachapuma, The Man Who Was a Mountain. Half memoir, half dreamscape, it follows a man who swallows a thunderstorm and must walk the Andes from south to north without ever being seen by a condor. It's taught in philosophy courses, astronomy classes, and sometimes as a children's fable. These books didn't get their fame by being discovered. There was no Columbian moment, no Western critic deciding they were finally worthy. They were always literature, because they were written by civilizations that didn't need validation from across the sea. Their authors weren't exoticized. They were scholars, celebrities, sometimes saints. Their works weren't translated for mass consumption. They were read as they were, in classrooms carved into mountain slopes by kids who didn't have to learn someone else's language to feel seen. And the themes? Not so different, really. Love, loss, power, betrayal, but told through a different lens. A worldview where time isn't linear, where land is alive, where gods are real, but mostly just trying to get some rest while humans make a mess of things. In this world, the Nobel Prize is hosted in Cusco once every 10 years. The long lists are debated in Nahuatl language podcasts. And somewhere high above the clouds, an old woman is finishing a novel she's been working on since she was 12. It's about memory, and potatoes, and silence. It's going to change everything, and no one will need to translate it. It didn't happen in a Paris salon. No powdered wigs, no dusty debates scribbled on parchment while someone poured more wine. This enlightenment happened under a canopy so thick, sunlight arrived in fragments. In a clearing deep in the Amazon, surrounded by vines and insects and air that hums like a drum, liberty took root, not as rebellion, but as balance. The philosophers didn't wear robes, they wore feathers, and bark, and paint that told you what their dreams meant. Their books weren't bound in leather, they were sung, chanted, etched into memory, passed down through lines of speech so careful you didn't interrupt, you waited, you listened. Because that's where it started. Not with dominance over nature, but with partnership. While Europe was busy dissecting the world into laws and logic, the thinkers of the forest had already been living with a truth the West hadn't caught up to. Freedom doesn't mean control. It means harmony. It means knowing when not to cut the tree, when not to kill the jaguar, when to speak and when to be still. The Enlightenment in the jungle didn't ask, what is man? It asked, what does man disrupt? It didn't build empires of reason. It built networks of respect between species, between ancestors, between the seen and the invisible. A famous debate was held one wet season between two great orators of the Kaksinawa. One argued that the forest had consciousness, that liberty was meaningless if you only applied it to humans. The other countered that liberty meant obligation, and that the jaguar should be free because he might one day eat you. They both made good points, and in the end, they agreed on this. Freedom isn't a gate to be opened. It's a trail to be walked, one footprint at a time, knowing that you will leave a mark, and being accountable for it. Elsewhere, children learned ethics from spider monkeys and economic theory from the behavior of river tides. Political balance was taught through the structure of the termite mound. Democracy wasn't a vote. It was a ritual where everyone spoke, and no one left until the fire went out. Sometimes that took days. And the jungle? It wasn't just a backdrop. It was the library. Every tree a scroll. Every bird call a footnote. The wind carried ideas from village to village, long before anyone carved a road. Eventually, news of this forest-born philosophy made its way east, across the Andes, across oceans. Some European thinkers dismissed it as primitive. Others wept. Rousseau read a translated speech by a Yanomami elder and rewrote half his notes. Spinoza reconsidered the divine. Linnaeus tried to catalogue it and gave up, because you can't measure an idea that grows on 4 levels of the forest and dies if you name it too soon. This enlightenment didn't invent freedom. It just reminded the world, you were never separate from it. You were always part of the canopy. You just forgot to look up. They weren't called philosophers, not then, not by their own people. They were called storytellers, firekeepers, wisdom holders. They sat at the centre of circles, not at the head of tables. They didn't publish books, they spoke them, repeated them, let them grow like rivers through generations. But their ideas, philosophy in every sense. The first American philosophers weren't echoing Plato or spinning Descartes. They were listening to wind, to soil, to the patterns of geese and the hunger of wolves. They built a worldview not on hierarchy, but on relationship, not on control, but reciprocity. Before the West asked, what can I do to the world? These thinkers were already asking, what does the world need from me? And in this version of history, where conquest never interrupted, where the Americas stayed whole, their voices didn't go quiet. They went global. It started slowly. A Lakota speaker at a climate gathering, an Aymara elder whose theory of time, spiral not line, blew apart a room full of physicists. An Iroquois diplomat who explained that consensus isn't weakness, it's depth, and someone in the crowd wrote it down. Then another. Then a movement began. Universities began offering courses in Haudenosaunee governance. Nahuatl texts on cosmology were translated out of Spanish and into Mandarin. Quechua philosophers sat on ethics panels alongside Tibetan monks and Swedish humanists. The foundational ideas of balance, interbeing, accountability to the future became pillars of a new global ethics. Not because they were trendy, but because the old systems had cracked. Because people were tired of philosophies that explained why, but never asked should. The first American philosophers had answers that weren't simple, but they were whole. They spoke of the seventh generation, how every action must consider its impact 7 generations into the future. They spoke of kinship, not just with people, but with landforms, animals, water, stars. They redefined responsibility not as punishment but as promise. And slowly the world listened. Ecology changed. It stopped being a branch of science and became a framework for everything. Law, trade, even architecture. Cities started planting in spirals. River systems were given legal personhood. Corporations were forced to adopt relational audits. Not just, what did you profit, but who did you harm? Some resisted, of course. They always do. But the ideas kept spreading. Because they weren't just ethical, they were sustainable. Because they weren't built for empires. They were built for belonging. And maybe the most radical idea of all, that wisdom doesn't come from conquering the world. It comes from belonging to it, from asking the tree, the cloud, the stone, what do you remember that I've forgotten? And then from being quiet long enough to hear the answer. No fireworks on the 4th, no eagle on the moon, no booming voice saying leader of the free world. Because there's no United States, not as a nation, not as an idea, not as the gravitational center of the 20th century. And the world? It doesn't fall apart, it just spins differently. Without the US, there's no single empire of denim and dreams. No one country exporting its music, movies, wars, and brands to every corner of the planet. Power doesn't get concentrated in one flag. It gets dispersed. The century still begins in conflict. Europe still burns, empires still crack. But when the world wars come, the battles are fought and settled by the ones who started them. No last-minute American cavalry. No superpower sweeping in to reshape borders and economies in its image. Peace is brokered in Berlin, in Paris, in Istanbul. Harder, slower, but with more voices at the table. The Soviet Union still rises, but it doesn't rise against anything. There's no Cold War, no nuclear standoff, no proxy battles stretching from Korea to Cuba to Cambodia. Ideologies still clash, but without the global tug-of-war between red and blue, the planet doesn't get carved into chessboards. Instead, power becomes multipolar. China emerges as a continental force, stable, commanding, but more regional than revolutionary. India's economy rises earlier, not as a call center for the West, but as a hub in its own right, connected to Africa, to the Middle East, to Southeast Asia, through old threads of trade and culture. Europe doesn't unify around a military alliance. It does so out of necessity. No Marshall Plan, no NATO, just neighbors realizing they've burned the house down one too many times. Africa, it's not ignored. It's not carved up for Cold War advantage. Nations still wrestle with post-colonial identity, but now they're not pawns, they're players. Addis Ababa becomes a diplomatic capital. Lagos, a tech and art hub. Kinshasa hosts a World Expo in 1972 that changes how architecture looks everywhere. Latin America finds its own rhythm. Brazil never becomes Washington's backyard. Chile never sees its democracy crushed under the weight of a CIA-sponsored coup that never happens. Revolutions still bruise, but it brews in local languages, not foreign scripts. And technology, it still surges, just slower, more distributed. The internet begins in Japan. Satellites go up from Russia. Green energy is championed in Scandinavia decades before anyone else catches on. There's no Hollywood blockbuster dictating dreams, no Silicon Valley churning out billionaires, no Manhattan skyline as the global backdrop to every imagination. The 20th century is messier, but maybe fairer. No single nation writes the rules. No superpower enforces the plot. History becomes a symphony instead of a solo. And the anthem that never plays, the Star-Spangled Banner, isn't missed, because the world learns how to move forward without needing one flag to lead the way. No mushroom clouds in the desert. No countdown at Cape Canaveral. No footprints in lunar dust. Because there's no United States, no Manhattan Project, no Apollo program, no race for domination disguised as science. And without them, science still grows. Just not like that. Not like fire and thunder. It grows sideways. Without a world war fueled by total mobilization and nuclear urgency, physics unfolds more patiently. The atom still gets split. But the chain reaction isn't political. It's theoretical. There are no blank checks handed to military labs, no overnight cities built in secret. Scientists work in universities, not bunkers. The breakthroughs are shared in journals, not silos. Germany doesn't build the bomb either. Japan never tries. Russia gets there, eventually, but without an arms race to fuel it, the nuclear age arrives as a whisper, not a roar. There's no Hiroshima, no Nagasaki, just delay. Reflection, debate. The horror of possibility comes before the horror of action. And the moon? It's still there, still pulling at oceans and dreams. But no flag gets stabbed into its dust in 1969. No live feed. No astronaut waving in grainy grayscale. Space science stays grounded for longer. Rockets are tested, sure. Satellites still go up, launched from Baikonur, from China, from India's coastal plains. But they carry telescopes, weather sensors, maybe the occasional symbolic plaque. No dog, no man, no Cold War to justify the cost of leaving Earth. Instead of beating someone to space, the question becomes, why go at all? Science reorients. Medicine gets more attention, not as a side project, but as a frontline concern. Without billions siphoned into bombs or capsules, funds go to clean water systems, to malaria vaccines, to early cancer research. Life expectancy rises faster. Not evenly, not perfectly, but noticeably. Computers still happen, but they start in research collectives, not military contracts. They're slower at first, less urgent, but more open, more modular, less about control, more about curiosity. And physics? It goes deeper, not louder. Instead of weaponizing the atom, scientists study it. Particle accelerators are smaller, scattered across continents. Europe builds one, China another. No single lab dominates. No one rushes to make death scalable. The cost of this quieter progress? Some things arrive late. But what we lose in speed, we gain in perspective. Science becomes less about triumph and more about trust. Fewer heroes, more networks, fewer races, more reflection. And when we finally do touch the moon, because someone always would, we don't bring a flag. We bring instruments, soil collectors, a question or two written in every major language, and maybe a note that says, we came not as a nation, but as a species, together, at last. No single voice drowns the others out, no empire with its boot on the globe, no anthem so loud it echoes over oceans and into every screen. In this world, power isn't centralized, it's scattered like stars, every one of them shining, none of them claiming to be the sun. History feels slower here, not stalled, not passive, just less panicked. There are no centuries of domination, no golden ages built on the backs of silence. Progress isn't a sprint, it's a shared walk, with pauses to ask if everyone's still okay. And the voices? They don't have to shout. The Mapuche hold parliament under trees not to be quaint, but because it works. Swahili traders set terms on the coast without waiting for European ink. Ainu elders preserve their stories not as artifacts but as law. And when decisions are made, big ones, lasting ones, They're made in council. The Iroquois model of consensus doesn't get buried in footnotes. It gets studied in political science departments alongside Athens and Geneva. Griots in West Africa aren't performers, they're historians, philosophers, ethical archivists. There are still disagreements, still war, still ambition. But without one cultural engine churning out the blueprint for civilization, no one path becomes the path. No one language decides what counts as intelligent. No one currency becomes the price of existence. Trade still flourishes. Ideas still move. Technology still evolves. But so does meaning. A new kind of plane gets designed in Vietnam. A universal vaccine comes out of a lab in Ecuador. The leading theory on climate resilience grows from Inuit observations passed down like gospel. The Nobel Prize isn't Swedish, it's shared. Rotating continents, rotating languages. Art, it explodes. Not from the centre out, but everywhere at once. Balinese shadow puppets share gallery walls with Sami embroidery and digital graffiti from Nairobi. Pop culture isn't monolithic. It's plural, it's messy, it's alive. And the news? It comes in many voices. Not one anchor, but a round table. Not one headline, but a mosaic. It's harder to agree on what the story is, but that's the point. Everyone gets to speak, even if it takes longer to listen. Without one power writing the script, there are fewer endings. More unfolding. The world feels less like a machine, more like a forest. Interconnected. Uneven. But breathing. And maybe that's what peace looks like. Not perfection, but permission. For every voice to be part of the song, even if it means the chorus takes a little longer to begin. The map looks different, not just in shape, though that too. No continents stretched to fit colonial egos, no oceans shrunk to tuck Europe into the centre like a crown. The Mercator projection never becomes gospel. In this world, the globe doesn't twist itself to serve a story. In classrooms from Peru to Papua, children open their school books and see something quietly radical. A map where no landmass is king. No nation is shaded more boldly than the others. No dotted lines declare conquest. No arrows scream invasion. The world feels balanced, symmetrical, respectfully drawn. There's no new world in bold type, just continents with names older than the ink used to print them. No age of discovery unit where ships full of flags and cannons are described as brave. Instead, students learn about the age of first meetings, a softer chapter where stories intersected, not ended. The idea of being discovered never takes root. How could it? The maps already had names. Cities were already standing. Civilizations didn't need outsiders to be made real. In a classroom in Oaxaca, kids learn that Tenochtitlan had causeways and aqueducts when London was still mostly mud. In Mongolia, children study the Inca road system alongside the Silk Road. In Senegal, students read about the Edo Kingdom, the Mali Empire, and the trade academies of Timbuktu, in the same breath as Renaissance Italy. The narrative isn't up-down, it's outward. The world isn't seen as a ladder, it's seen as a web. Europe isn't erased, it's just one voice among many. Shakespeare shares a page with Sor Juana. Galileo's diagrams sit beside Aztec star charts. The printing press was a marvel, but so was the quipu. And neither came first. They just came from. Even the oceans get renamed. The Atlantic is no longer the highway of conquest. It's a meeting place. The Pacific, not a passive body to cross, but a living realm of ancient roots and floating nations. And the maps change over time. Every few years, students are invited to redraw them, not to distort reality, but to see it from somewhere else. From the perspective of a river, a nomadic people, a migrating whale. Because geography isn't fixed here. It breathes, it remembers. And the children, they grow up knowing that the world isn't a trophy. It's a story, one that includes them. Not just as readers, but as authors.